Hey everyone, my name is Tyler and welcome back to the St. Saviour's Virtual Youth Group. If you're joining us for the first time, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so that you get notified every time we post a new video. And if you haven't seen any of our previous videos, check out our YouTube channel, Facebook page, or our parish website. Let's get started. Today's topic: addiction. Addiction is such a complex topic, and so I have two incredible special guests today who are going to share their thoughts and opinions on addiction from two very different perspectives. Today we're going to be talking about why people get addicted to drugs and alcohol, the road to recovery, and the positive impacts that finding sobriety and living a positive, healthy, balanced lifestyle can do. This topic is really close to my heart, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in general, addiction and talking about substance abuse is such an important conversation to have, especially with youth today. To get started, check out this video on what is addiction.
What is addiction? It's also called a substance use disorder. Over 20 million people nationwide suffer from addiction. 1 in 7 people will experience addiction at some point in their life. Scientists first began to understand addiction as a brain disorder back in the 1950s. Doctors Olds and Milner, in laboratory studies of rats, found the parts of the brain affected by addiction. But then in 1994, Drs. Volkoff and Shelbert, top neuroscientists, ran PET scans of the brain that showed the effects of substance use disorders. And like other diseases, these scans showed it affected tissue function. So there are two main parts of the brain affected by drug use: the limbic system and the cortex. The limbic system, located deep within the brain, is responsible for our basic survival instincts. So when you do essential things to stay alive, like eat, drink, find shelter, have sex, or care for your young, your brain reinforces behaviors that cause the release of dopamine from this region. That reward for surviving is also transmitted to the amygdala and hippocampus, which records a memory of that feeling, so we seek it again. This is our survival hardwiring. Addiction also affects this area, up here. That's the prefrontal cortex, which is what separates us from other animals. And this is where decision-making and impulse control live. When drugs or alcohol are used, they activate the very same dopamine process in the survival center. And when use is repeated, that substance can hijack that part of the brain. This hijacker changes the brain and weakens this system to make it believe that the primary need for survival is the drug. In hijacking the brain, it can usurp those primary motivations: food, water, shelter, sex, and protecting our young. And the hijacker needs more and more of the substance to activate the same level of reward or feeling of pleasure, causing the brain tissue to become increasingly damaged with continued drug use. So why don't all people who use alcohol or drugs become addicted? There are factors that contribute to the development of a substance use disorder. They include individual factors like your genes, your age of exposure, and then environmental factors like drug availability. But there is good news. Addiction is preventable. Key factors that aid in preventing addiction can be categorized into two parts: risk factors and protective factors. Protective factors range from parental involvement, programs that improve self-control, limiting availability, and increasing attachment to your community. Another key element in preventing substance use disorders is to delay when use begins. Put simply, prevention is about delaying the onset of first use. In the adolescent brain, where brain tissue is more vulnerable, the hijacker is more prone to weaken the brain and plant itself as a disease. Those with substance use disorders commonly initiate first use much earlier, between 12 and 18 years old, which increases the likelihood of the hijacker taking hold. But if the hijacker does take hold, addiction is treatable. Advancements have been made in assessments, treatment programs, recovery supports, and medications to treat addiction. Brain scans show that once in recovery, the tissue in the limbic system and cortex can get better. With your help, we can expand these innovations to help millions of individuals and families and ensure that addiction is treated as the medical issue that it is. Together, we can solve this.
Our first guest works on the counseling and recovery side of addiction. We're going to hear from her now.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining us. Why don't you first start by telling everybody who you are and what you do?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jane McCarvill, and I am an addictions counselor. I work at the Addictions Foundation of Manitoba, and I counsel people, mostly women, in a residential setting. It's where women come to treatment when they feel that they can't control their addictions just on a outpatient basis. So they come in house for treatment, and this is a 28-day program.
Awesome. Well, thank you for talking with me today. Yeah, we're going to be talking about addiction, just how important it is to have those conversations, right? And just kind of making it more mainstream and something normal that we can talk about, like a lot of the topics that we've covered over the last few weeks.
Okay.
So first off, right off the bat, why is it so important to talk about addiction?
It is certainly a hot topic for today, in today's society. I first want to just read a quote from a gentleman by the name of Dr. Gabor Mate. He's kind of a specialist in the addictions field, and this is his definition of what addiction is. And addiction is a complex psychophysical process which manifests in any behavior, whether it is substance related or not, that a person craves, finds temporary relief of or pleasure in, suffers negative consequences as a result of, but still persists in and is unable to give it up. So that's kind of the definition. It's important to talk about addictions today as there's lots of misconceptions about what addicts are, what addiction looks like. Sometimes we think of the addict being the person standing outside of a hotel or on a street corner begging for money. We think of people that we hear on the news that have overdosed. Those are the addicts, or those are the people that have addictions. But in reality, it's really it can be anybody. People who have issues with addictions come from every walk of life, every gender, every kind of class or socioeconomic stature. So we kind of have to let go of some of those stereotypes. As well, there's a lot of stigma associated with addiction. We don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to go there. We certainly just don't want to look and see what's going on and why these things are happening.
Yeah, I think sometimes it seems easier just to not talk about it.
Absolutely, it certainly is. But it's out there, and there's a lot of people that are certainly experiencing different types of addiction right now.
So for you, for your job, what does a typical day kind of look like for you?
Well, as I said before, I work with mostly women, and my day would be doing a lot of counseling, which looks like group counseling. So we would meet like in a sharing circle and just talk about our feelings. We would also talk in a group where we would give them a lot of information, which is called a psychoeducational group. So that's where all the knowledge of resources and different mindfulness techniques, different tools that each of these women can choose what works for them to help them discover alternatives to their coping mechanism, which has been using whatever substance or behavior that helps them. As well, I do a lot of one-on-one counseling with assigned clients. And of course, I do a bit of crisis intervention when, as you can imagine, being in a community of approximately 20 to 25 women, it's difficult. Things come up. So I do do some crisis intervention where just to help people kind of get along. And as you imagine, when you're not using a substance which is numbing your feelings, you're going to have all kinds of feelings that are going to come up. And it's like, it's something that you really may have never experienced before, because maybe since you were young, you were always told that you should shove down your feelings and not talk about it. So naturally, when strong feelings of, say, anger or resentment or sadness come up, it does cause some dysfunction in the house, but also it's a healthy thing too, because these feelings are coming up and they need to be looked at.
Yeah. So what do you think is the most challenging part of your job?
I think the most challenging for me is listening to the stories of some of the women that come in, and how they have been, for example, experienced trauma in their lives. I mean, I would say 100% of them have in some sort of way. There's a spectrum of trauma, though. You can go from maybe some all the way to, some sexual or physical or emotional abuse. So hearing what they've gone through is difficult. And a lot of the women there have been affected by residential schools, and being a daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter of Indigenous peoples that have been in residential schools. So hearing those stories is difficult. When I listen to those stories, I feel very honored to listen to their stories, but yet again, it affects me, and I have to make sure that I take care of myself, because every day I have to come in being a positive person, a positive influence on these ladies. And I also need to kind of detach as well, but still remain compassionate.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, right? And you're going to have lots of really, really sad and real stories coming from these women. And so, yeah, you have to kind of balance, right? How do you still go about your day, but still be there for them as much as you can?
Absolutely. There is a lot, like you mentioned, there's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of grief. A lot of these women have experienced great losses, whether it's family members passing away, as I mentioned, some, experience some PTSD, some violence in their homes, as well as just all of that together is just, it comes out as very, it's very sad. And it also kind of generates feelings in me, why this all has to happen. But now, knowing all of the feelings that they're feeling and their experiences, they're survivors. They learn to cope by using a substance or a behavior to survive. So when you look at it that way, there's much more compassion for that person, that was their only option. They had no other tools but to pick up a drink or pick up a drug to make sure that they could, or to be able to self-soothe. Otherwise, I don't know if they would have been able to survive. So
Right.
When we look at the reason why people start using a substance or a behavior, we see it as a coping mechanism. So we try, at least my perspective is, we see the functionality of it, why they're doing it, and not to blame the person for doing what they had to do to survive. If people could really look at it that way, instead of just saying, well, they should just stop. I mean, their kids are being taken away. Why can't they just stop? Do it for their family, do it for whoever. That doesn't work. So we have to take a different approach. And we try to get to the root cause of what's going on, which takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot more time than the 28 days that the ladies are in. So What I do is that we just kind of get them going on in recovery, And this is kind of like their little baby step. And then we lead them to other resources in the community where they can continue the recovery, like with 12-step programs, with other, which is called second stage housing. It gives them a little bit more freedom, but it also is supportive. It's a place of like a sober house where they can live.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much, yeah, how it goes.
So you talk a lot about like the families and stuff, and from your perspective, how does addiction affect the family dynamic? And I think on the flip side, have you seen some families reunited because of the women, going through your programming and
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the ladies, I have to say, are in program because they have had their children removed from them through CFS care and other means. So I do see a lot of change and looking at family dynamics and the role it's played in developing an addiction, or also being a motivator for women to get well so they can be reunited with their children. And I've seen it happen. I've also, like, I don't see them actually them being reunified, but I set up the situations where they can be reunify. The word, I'm not sure, where they can be brought back together with their families, not just their children, but they can restore relationships with their parents, with siblings, because they learn how to express themselves and find out what they need to ask for, what their needs are, and this kind of helps set the boundaries for getting back into their families.
Very cool. So the pandemic that's happening right now, how has that affected maybe your work and the way you operate, but also, just addiction and substance abuse in general?
Well, the pandemic, as you know, probably personally, well, for me anyway, it's caused a lot of anxiety. There's so many unknowns as to what's going to happen tomorrow. Like, everything can just change, very, very quickly. So for a lot of people that are already experiencing some anxiety or depression or, a mental health issue, this could push them over the edge where they do start to pick up something to help them calm down, to make them feel better, to make them feel that they have a little bit of power. What I've heard in the media and on the news is that sales of alcohol has gone up at least 30% since this whole pandemic has started. So this says to me that, this increased consumption of alcohol is people are trying to find a way to just get through their days by, consuming that alcohol. Also as well, there's been a spike in overdoses in Winnipeg and Manitoba. There's a lot of unsafe, what we call street drugs that are out there, and people don't even know what they are getting as far as if they want to go and purchase something. I don't know what the word would be, the cleanliness or the purity, purity of the substance is, there's no restrictions. Everything is mixed together. For example, if you're looking for an item like, say, cocaine, it's most of the time it's spiked with fentanyl, and fentanyl is so potent that if you misuse it, those are the things that is the chemical, that's the drug that will lead to an overdose. So as far as the pandemic, yes, it's increased a lot of harm in people. But again, it's a way to escape. That's why people, they want to leave the reality of the situation for a little while, right? You want some relief, you want some stress relief, all of those factors. That's why people have a casual drink or have a casual, some weed, or play video games, or
whatever that is for somebody.
For whatever it is. And it all can start off very innocently, but when the addiction starts, is that when you start thinking about it all the time, and that you want to be partaking in it all the time, and you feel very agitated and restless when you're not having the substance or doing the behavior. That's when it changes from something that's pleasurable to something that you become dependent, and it starts causing harm in your life.
Well, and when it completely replaces actual feeling of any of those things, stress or anxiety, and like you said, when it's the only thing you can think about, when it just takes over your life, right?
Yes. That's when you realize that there's a problem there, and unfortunately, a lot of things have to be lost. You have to lose a lot of things in your life before sometimes you realize that this is a problem. Because we choose to ignore things. We may deny it. We may think, it's not so bad, and look at other people, what they're doing. I'm not doing that. So a lot of different factors come into play before someone actually asks for help.
So I know you work with a lot of women who probably are older and have families and children and stuff, but I think a lot of these issues and substance abuse does start when people are quite young. And so what would you say to a young person who might be struggling with addiction?
What I would say to someone who may be feeling that they're getting caught up into something, I would say, don't worry about it right now. I would say, look at what this behavior or substance you're using, what it's doing for you right now, and just be curious about what's going on. And don't beat yourself up, because you are, especially, one thing I didn't speak about is that we're all doing the best that we can. And that sometimes we have to just sit back and just look at it and see what's going on. However, having said that, if this person is thinking that it's getting a little bit starting to control their lives, if it's affecting relationships, and as well, if it's isolating you from other people, from the world, if you feel very alone, lonely, that's the point where you can reach out for some help and talk to an adult, someone that you really trust, and say, hey, this is what's going on for me. I need some help. What can I do?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that you need to just ask for help. There are resources. There are people you can talk to. There is outlets that aren't, those addictive substances or behaviors. There are other ways to cope with stress and anxiety in your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important
Yes.
to have the conversation and just get it out there and start talking about it. And like you said, not isolate yourself, not let it control your actions or take over, parts of your life, but to, just start talking about it.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a ton of resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, with COVID, there's a lot of things that aren't in person, but there's also lots of Zoom going on, which is probably second best, but at least it's something. If someone is looking for specific resources on addiction, I would definitely suggest that they call the Addictions Foundation. there's a lot of information at that organization. They also have a library as well that you can go find out more information. There's videos, there's all kinds of excellent resources. Also, and it's also a place where you can get set up with a counselor if you need to talk about what's happening in your life. More importantly, if things are really getting bad, there is Clinic, which has a 24-hour crisis line that you can contact. Oh, and one thing I forgot was the Addictions Foundation also has a 24-hour line. It's not really a crisis line, but it's someone at the other end of the phone that can direct you and give you some more information and take care of you. So if you need some numbers, I'm happy to leave that with you if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'll link a bunch of those below for people to see and just get those out there.
Okay.
Awesome.
That
well, thank you so much, Jane.
Thanks so much for your time, and I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks so much to Jane McCarvill again for talking with us, and shout out to the Addictions Foundation of Manitoba. They have a 24/7 hotline that you can call if you ever want to talk to somebody. They have resources on their website, and there are so many other places where you can go to get more information on addiction, substance abuse, and the road to recovery. Jane mentioned a leading physician in mental health awareness and addictions counseling, Dr. Gabor Mate. Check out this next video where he shares his thoughts on addiction.
All the substances of abuse, whether they're opiates or cocaine or anything else, they're actually painkillers. Some of them specifically are painkillers. But physical pain and emotional pain, the suffering is experienced in the same part of the brain. So when people suffer emotional rejection, the same part of the brain will light up as if you stuck them with a knife. The Eckhart Tolle says very nicely that addictions begin with pain and end with pain. So that all the addictions are attempts to soothe the pain. So when I work with addictions, the first question is always not why the addiction, but why the pain. And what you find is emotional loss or trauma. In the case of the severe addicts, as in the downtown East Side here, they were every single one of them traumatized. There's no women walking the streets here who have not been sexually abused, not even by accident. But whether it's a sex addiction or internet or relationship or shopping or work addiction, these are all attempts to get away from distress. Keith Richards, the Rolling Stone guitarist, said, who used to have a severe heroin habit, as you know, he said that all the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. Or why would somebody not want to be themselves? Because they're in too much distress and too much pain. So I don't care what they tell you about genetics or any of that choices or any of that nonsense. It's always about pain. Well, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, it's got a wonderful line in it. Whatever you do, don't try and escape from your pain, but be with it. Because the attempt to escape from pain is what creates more pain. And that's the reality with addiction. But the question is, how can people be with their pain? Well, only if they sense some compassion from somebody. So as another teacher says, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So addicted people need a compassionate present which will permit them to experience their pain without having to run away from it. And all the attempts to run away, it's like another teacher says, the surest way to go to hell is to try to run away from hell. So you got to be with that pain. You just have to be with it, but you have to have some support. And we live in a society that, one way or the other, is always about instant relief, quick satisfaction, distraction. In other words, we live in a culture that is based on, both economically and psychologically, on not supporting people to be with themselves. So it's always the quick getaway. So it's very difficult to deal with addictions in a society. But yeah, it is a matter of, at some point, finding a way of being with your pain so that you can actually get to know what it's really all about.
As I said earlier, this topic is very close to my heart. Our next guest is my aunt, Henriette, who's going to share her personal journey with addictions and substance abuse, her road to recovery, and how she found sobriety through the 12-step program and Alcoholics Anonymous, and the challenges that came with that.
Welcome, and thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi. Why don't you start by introducing yourself and letting everybody know what you do?
Of course. Well, my name is Henriette Ivanans-McIntyre, and I am an author. I just happen to have a copy of my book here, right here.
Yes.
There we go. It's a memoir about the year that my husband and I went through a kidney transplant, and I was heavily addicted to prescription drugs and alcohol. I'm 52. I spent a number of years living in Los Angeles, and prior to that in Toronto, and now I live in beautiful Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for talking. I think it's going to be really cool to let people hear your story, hear your perspective on addiction and what that means to you, and hopefully share some insights with, young people anywhere who are listening that maybe are struggling to, or, have dealing with these same things that you've dealt with as well.
Yeah, 100%. Anything to help.
So why don't you start by just kind of sharing an overview of your journey with addiction, your kind of the beginning, middle, and end, maybe, if you want. Not that there is an official end, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, great point. But yes, absolutely. So I would say I had my first kidney transplant back in Toronto when I was 19 years old. And I always share about this, everything about recovery. I would just want to preface by saying I learned through the lens of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's not a plug for Alcoholics Anonymous. That's just how I got sober. And so everything is kind of through that lens and what I've learned there through the 12 steps. But when I was 19, I had my first kidney transplant. And when I was discharged, I remember the nurse said to me, if you still have pain, you can go to any pharmacy in Toronto and get Tylenol 1s over the counter. And she had sent me home with a prescription for Tylenol 3. And I remember the moment where I didn't take my pain medication as prescribed because I didn't really have a lot of pain. And so the time had sort of come and gone for that pain med, but I still had this kind of craving for it. And I remember taking it. I was about 19 years old. I was sitting on my bed, and this feeling came over me unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I felt empowered. I felt completely comfortable in my skin, and I never wanted that feeling to end. And at the time I had a boyfriend that was overseas, and I remember writing him this letter, and I was able to just express myself in a way that I never had before. And it was, that was the moment. That was just the first moment for me. They say in Alcoholics Anonymous that you never forget your first drink, you never forget your first drug. And that was my moment for sure. And I continued to do that. I did go and get drugs over the counter, Tylenol 1 with codeine, which you can't anymore in Canada, which is good that they shut that down. And I did that from age 19 until 42, until I went into rehab. And even during the years that Kevin and I lived in Los Angeles, I came back and forth to Toronto quite a number of times. And I would pick up and I would traffic back just bottles of this stuff, like 200 caplets, 5 bottles at a time. I would just like perfectly entitled to do this, like no reservations. I had justified it in my head, rationalized it in my mind that this was something that was totally fine to do. And by the time I was 40 years old, I went into chronic kidney transplant rejection with my first kidney transplant. And that was really, they talk about this a lot in addiction, that often when somebody's alcoholism or addiction escalates, it's usually triggered by some kind of a traumatic event. And for me, that traumatic event was going into chronic kidney transplant rejection at age 40. And I just had no tools to deal with it. I had no way to deal with it. What became my tools, I was in so much fear. I was just in so much fear. My tools became drinking, alcohol, drugs, and another component was really treating people badly, like feeling justified in my self-pity, justified in my anger, justified in dismissing people. And that's a whole other component to the 12 steps, which is what I believe is the spiritual deficiency. But at any rate, I did have another kidney transplant. You know, at that point, Tyler, my addiction had really escalated. You know, I was drinking every day, I was taking drugs every day. I was doing what they call doctor shopping, which is, you know, telling one doctor that I need a prescription and going to another doctor for the same prescription, and hiding your tracks so that the pharmacies don't keep up with you. And by the time I had my second kidney transplant, my husband was a match, your uncle. And by that point, the first thing I did after my kidney transplant, we were staying at a hotel up the street from Cedars-Sinai, because where we lived in LA was quite far from Cedars-Sinai. The first thing I did was have a Corona with my Dilaudid and my Percocet. That was the first thing I did. Made total sense to me, rationalized it in my mind. I was just celebrating a new kidney, and I really didn't understand why Kevin was so angry at me. And that was really the decline for me in those last 6 months. It completely escalated, out of control. All I wanted to do was drink. All I wanted to do was have more drugs. And 2 months before I went into rehab, there was one night that, and I always share about this because I need to be reminded of the insanity of this thing. There was one night I had run out of vodka, and it was 2 or 3 in the morning. And I remember sitting there thinking, there has to be alcohol in this house. There has to be something. And I knew I couldn't sneak out of the house. I would wake up my husband. And so I had this thought, and it was, well, it's alcohol. It's clear. It's just a higher proof. And so I made myself a little cocktail with rubbing alcohol and drank that. And I always share about that because that, to me, identifies and emphasizes really the insanity of addiction, how we really lose the power of choice. 2 months after that, I ended up in rehab, and that's where I was introduced to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's one way to get sober. There's many ways. It's the way that I choose. It's the way that I can't imagine my life without. It was a struggle. For almost 2 years, I relapsed a lot. I couldn't fully admit, I just couldn't fully admit that I had a problem, even with that bottom, even with that kind of physical and literal bottom. And today I have almost 7.5 years of sobriety. So I hope that wasn't too long of an answer, but
it's amazing. But it is an amazing story. And I love that you're always so open to share your story and every aspect of it. And people can obviously catch the entire story or a very large chunk of it in your book, which Absolutely. Is cool. And it's very open, and you are an open book, literally.
Yeah, and I'm an open book, and this is an open book. No,
yes, exactly. On Amazon.
Yeah.
So why do people get addicted to drugs?
Well, that's a great question. And truthfully, I don't know that we'll ever know. I think why becomes, in a lot of ways, not the wrong question to ask. In fact, it's a question that people ask all the time, because for a long time, I could have a drink and take it or leave it for many, many, many years. I was, what they call a periodic drinker. I would sometimes drink too many drinks and get sick and then leave it for months on end. There is something that occurs with an alcoholic, and I sort of use the terms interchangeably, alcoholic and addict, but there's something that happens with the alcoholic where we lose the power of choice. You just we talk about this invisible line where the way it's described in our literature is that I am just physically and mentally different from you guys. There's just something that once I've lost that power of choice, there's a craving in me once I have one drink or one pill that I can't overcome. I will continue to chase and perpetuate that feeling, that instant feeling that I get, and I'm really powerless against it. So why people become addicted to alcohol and drugs, for sure with pain meds, anybody can become physiologically addicted to them. But normal people, eventually, they can, wean themselves off if they've had a surgery or something like that. And they won't necessarily have that craving and that obsession to pursue the craving. But that's how we're different as alcoholics and addicts. So in getting sober, that becomes really not the wrong question, but a challenging question and sometimes a frustrating question. And There may or may not be a genetic component. There's certainly proof of that. You know, my father was an alcoholic. He died very young. He was 38 and he died of alcoholism. And so certainly there's components of it we understand, but honestly, Tyler, at the end of the day, it's very challenging. Why? A lot of alcoholics have wonderful childhoods, wonderful upbringings, and yet they become addicted to drugs and alcohol. So
I think that's it's a cool transition, because I think my next question is addiction a disease? And I know you've talked a lot about this, and you've always kind of been very clear that this is something that is a part of you before you were addicted. Like it's just something that was in you already. And like you said, maybe it's partly generational, maybe it's partly not generational, that's not the right word, partially genetics, you know, and part of your life. So do you think, obviously, that addiction is a disease?
I do. I don't believe that once you identify yourself, I don't believe for me, I will ever recover. And whether or not it is a disease is almost irrelevant to me. I choose to treat it as a disease, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. That's how I stay sober. So I always talk about my kidney transplant, for example. That is as a result of kidney disease. And so I do certain things every day to treat my kidney disease. I have a transplant. I take certain medications every day. I try to eat well every day. I try to exercise every day. I stay abreast of changes in transplantation. There's certain tools that I pick up every day to take care of my kidney disease, to protect my transplant. And so it helps me to look at addiction as a disease, as a trifold disease, really, that I have a physical allergy or a craving that I can't overcome, that I really have a mental obsession. There's just, and it continues to this day. And then I also believe that it's a spiritual deficiency, that I made alcohol, drugs, my higher power, completely my higher power. And so the way I treat this disease every day is through the 12 steps, is through prayer and meditation, is through going to regular meetings on regular meeting days, is through sponsoring other women, taking them through the 12 steps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many tools in this program. And I do want to stress that I believe it's a disease that continues because I no longer have the craving. Every once in a while, the thought passes my mind, but that's the key, is that it's a thought, that it centers in the way that I think. And this is a very challenging concept, I think, for normal people to grasp onto, that it really is a condition of being selfish and self-centered and obsessed with self. You know, I wake up every day and my whole world revolves around myself. And that's how I became powerless over drugs and alcohol. And when I can switch that thinking through a spiritual program like the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, then I can surrender this idea that I have any power over drugs and alcohol, because I've found a different higher power today. But it's a heady concept for some people, but it works. It works. It really does work. I mean, I have 7.5 years now, so I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah. So 7.5 years, that's amazing. And how has being sober changed your life?
Oh my gosh. Number one, 100%, I never had a God in my life. And for anybody, you know, that's watching this, that's maybe thinking they want to check out a meeting, just to be super, super clear, Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious program. There are a lot of people that have wonderful experiences with religion, and there are a lot of people that don't. And so in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, you have the opportunity to identify and create and cultivate a relationship with whatever your conception of a higher power is. And it's very freeing for a lot of people. It has been the single greatest experience of my life, has been to find a higher power. I call him Big G. That's just the way we hang, but you know, it has completely changed my life, because there have been things that have come up in sobriety that I never ever thought I would be able to walk through sober. And I know you know a little bit about one of these, but I suffered incredibly for about 3 years with a really painful nerve condition throughout my body. And every day I had to make the decision every day to get on my knees and to try and turn the situation over to God, because nothing else was working for me. I mean, I knew I couldn't drink. I knew I couldn't take drugs. I knew I couldn't try medical marijuana, even though I had the thought a couple of times. Like, I have fully conceded that I cannot touch these things. And it was a fascinating process, Tyler. I got on my knees every morning for years, and I would get angry at my God. I would tell him to, I would middle finger him. I would scream. I would cry. And in the process of doing that, it was very powerful and humbling, because I just felt closer and closer and closer to a God of my understanding. So undoubtedly, that is the greatest gift. The other gifts of being sober have been relationships that I've damaged, I've been able to restore. Yeah. And, very quickly, there were 8.5 years where I didn't see my brother, and 5.5 years where I didn't see my mother. And I don't take anybody else's inventory today. I caused a lot of damage there. And it's amazing. They're both in my life today. They both care about me. They both trust me with things. And there's no gift greater than that. It's amazing that I've been able to write a book and own a house and all this stuff. But that's the stuff of life. I'll tell you that right there. Yeah.
Well, the relationships are the most important, I think. And and I was talking to Jane this morning, and she even said, like, that's one of the reasons why the first thing that the women that she works with always say is like, well, I want to have a better relationship with my kids again. I want to have a better relationship with my parents again, my significant other. Like, that's the biggest loss that they feel that they've suffered in their life. And it's true, because that's the part of your life that gets affected the most, right? Because it's all those people in your life, right, who are directly affected by you and your actions. And
sorry to interrupt. It is a horrible disease in that regard, because the people that love the addict or the alcoholic are just as profoundly affected and damaged. It's not like a physical condition, which is also traumatic and painful to watch your loved one go through cancer or kidney failure, whatever. But this affects everybody on such a spiritual level, because they feel so powerless, and they are powerless over their loved one, that the damage that is caused. There's a saying in AA that, this disease wants me to die, that I believe, but it wants me to suffer first. Right. And I believe that for the family members as well. It's heartbreaking.
So like you said, it's never over. You're always, going through recovery, and the disease is not something that you're going to completely get rid of in your life. But on what were and are the challenges of being sober and staying sober?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think like anybody, I'm a human being, and I wake up, and some days I just don't want to do all these things that I have to do. And at the end of the day, I know, like, for example, I'll tell you a little bit, some of the things that I do. Right now I'm sponsoring 5 women, 3 in Los Angeles and 2 here in Winnipeg. I host 2 AA meetings on Zoom for women here in Winnipeg. I pray and I meditate every day. When I have a resentment that comes up towards somebody, it can cause me great anger. What I've identified as my character defects through doing the work through the 12 steps, they will come up for me. I'll be angry. I'll be in self-pity. I'll want to punish that person. And it's a lot of work. You have to be willing to, I have a sponsor in Los Angeles, and I have to be willing to be completely honest. And sometimes that's really, really hard. A lot of the times that's really, really hard. You have to allow your ego to become smashed. And that's where we find humility, is to tell another human being. Not, it's easy to, get on my knees and tell God that, oh, I'm angry at this person and this person sucks. I want this person to die. I have to actually do the work. There's work involved in staying sober. I have to talk to my sponsor. My sponsor more often than not, suggests that I do writing on it, suggests that I call other alcoholics to get out of my own head, to listen to how they're doing. And on most days, I welcome that kind of work, because the benefits are such that I can live in peace. I can live in, I have relief. I don't have the baggage that I used to have all of the time, but it is work. And, you know, like I said, I'm a human being, and some days you just don't feel like doing all of that. But more often than not nowadays, it feels too uncomfortable, if that makes any sense, to not do the work, to not really be willing to look at myself. You know, I've hosted a couple of book clubs, and at the last book club I was at, one of the women actually said something like, they really wanted to understand the fourth step and the fifth step, which is this personal inventory we do of our whole lives, of all our resentments, and then what our part was in it. And to be willing to look at what your part is in damage that you've done to another human being. Ouch. Like, it's initially really, really hard. It's painful. It leaves you feeling very raw and emotional. And one of the ladies there at the book club said something like, well, no wonder a lot of people don't stay sober, because I don't even know if I'd want to do that kind of work, you know? So I think that's at the end of the day, to answer your question, that's the hardest stuff, but usually I walk through it. Usually I don't stick in that feeling too long.
So I think the thing that I want to talk about is, and I talked about this too a little bit with Jane this morning, is that I obviously want to connect this back to youth. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of, well, you personally too, and a lot of addiction and substance abuse starts when you're young. It's, you know, it can start at any age, but I think there's a lot of young people who are affected by that right from the beginning. And that could be from so many different circumstances in their life. But what would you say to a young person who is struggling with addiction right now?
Well, first of all, I would listen. You know, before anything, I would ask them if they want to talk, if they want to share their story, if they want to talk about how they're feeling. You know, at the end of the day, if they are willing and if they're interested in getting sober, then you can have a conversation with them. And I think that is the most frustrating thing, is that when you're sitting on a solution and you know what works and will keep people sober, but you cannot force it. You just simply can't force it on somebody. So it's hard. It's how to explain this without sounding harsh, but you really can't force somebody. But if so, let's just work with the idea that they do want to get sober. You know, the way that I do it, you know, you were talking with Jane this morning, you know, and she's in a more professional capacity, but, you know, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I think the power of that, really, there's the 12 steps for sure. But when you sit in a meeting, there's such power and magic in just listening to 5, 10, 50, 100 other alcoholics share their story. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's required to stay alive to be rigorously honest. And there is such power in that head nodding, you know, that me too, that feeling of identification with somebody else that has done the same things that you've done, that has thought the same thoughts that you've done. I'll give you an example, and it's horrific, but I went to a meeting and this man shared about how he sold his father's dog to get money to buy crack. And I went, oh yeah, I can see why you do that. And you can't do that in the real world. Like, people are going to judge you. They're just going to walk circles around you on the sidewalk. You know, we are very, very blessed that we have an experience like that. So I would encourage somebody young to check out a youth AA meeting, or any AA meeting really, and listen with an open heart, and to focus on what is similar to your experience and not what is different. Because there's a lot of things. When I got into the rooms for the first time, I focused on these women that were complaining about, I don't know, their renovation was going too slow in their house, or I don't know, something like that. You know, and here I was fresh out of rehab. I just had my second kidney transplant. I had a lot of side effects. You know, I couldn't hear what was similar, which was that my perception is off. My thoughts are obsessed on self, you know, all of that. So I would certainly suggest that they try to do that too, and start there. You know, there is such power in in the group coming together with a shared experience. And I think the second you start to feel not alone in your own experience can be an opportunity to move forward with more willingness. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, well, in the group setting, right, it's just with, like you said, where everyone's being so honest, so open, and so accepting. There's something safe about that, and there's something that helps normalize the situation. And like you said, it makes you feel like you're not going through it alone. You're not the first person, to have experienced these things, and you won't be the last. And I think that would be, I think, a thing to tell a young person is that, like you said, get to a meeting and hear other people share their experiences, and realize that your experience is probably not that, that uncommon, right? And not that different.
Yep, 100%. And then you can't really force them, which is, like I mentioned earlier on, which is incredibly frustrating. But, the statistics are grim, and you have to be willing. There's only 10 to 13% of people that get and stay sober, because it is such a cunning disease, because it really is centered in the way that we think. I know from my own experience with medical science, they just want to wrap it all up. They just want to figure it out and treat it. And it's just not like that. It really is spiritual. And so all the spiritual things that I've talked about today, the community, a higher power, connection one-on-one with a sponsor working with you, that's where the healing is in all of those components.
Yeah. And it's not a one-way fix, right? There's not one solution like a doctor might think, right? There isn't only one way to find sobriety, to deal with what you're experiencing. There's so many different ways, and it's going to be different for everybody.
Yep. 100%. Yep.
So I think we're going to wrap up in a sec. So is there any other words of wisdom that you'd like to impart on us before we finish?
I think just to reiterate what I was saying, that you're not alone. You are not alone. And that it is really hard in the beginning. I think in a way, getting sober for me, that first part that I call early sobriety was almost worse when I was out there drinking and using and, being irresponsible and feeling disconnected and not showing up and treating people badly. I would almost take that over early sobriety. And so I would encourage anybody that's young and trying to get sober to try and find people that are around your age. I've sponsored women who are considerably younger than me, like in their 20s. And that was a very significant part of them getting sober, was finding the same age group. Because it's a very cultural thing too, right? When you're younger, there's just typically more drinking and using and partying, right? But to know that it's going to be uncomfortable for a while. And what makes you feel more comfortable in your skin is the process of the 12 steps. And if you choose to do that route, and there's just simply no way around it. There's no way of pushing through that process. It's a process which by definition takes time. Yeah. And to trust the process, if you are interested in doing the 12 steps, look for a sponsor, look for somebody that they always say they have what you want, which can be like a glow about them or a lightness, or, they speak solution. When they talk at the meeting, they're not just complaining. It's like, well, what am I going to do about this problem in my life? They're offering up some kind of a solution. And I also personally would like to add, when you're looking for a sponsor, find a sponsor that has a higher power, that really, because that is the whole point of the 12 steps and the program, is to find a higher power that can solve your problem. And my problem is the way that I think. And that's where alcoholism is centered. So look for that too. But just to hang on, the beginning is really rough because you are not quite connected. And that's what you get, when you get sober and you work a program, you get connected, and I have become connected to a higher power, to God, to Big G, to my friends and family, again, to sponsees, to Mother Earth, and to myself. I was just disconnected from all of it. And it's just simply a process to get there again.
Thank you so much again to Henriette for sharing her story, sharing her advice and wisdom, and her experience with everybody today, especially young people that are listening. If you didn't catch the plug at the beginning of the interview, she has written a memoir about her experiences with her kidney transplant, addiction, rehab, and relapse. It's available on Amazon today. I will link it below. Well, I think we've learned that very similar to mental health, addiction is all about starting conversations. It is so important to remember that you aren't alone on this journey. You need to find someone that is willing to listen. It is normal to talk about addiction. Addiction affects 1 in 7 people worldwide. It is crucial that we continue to have conversations, especially with young people. Addiction is a disease, and if you know someone who's struggling in your life, remember, show them compassion, give them time, and show them love, and always be there to listen. Thanks again to Jane and Henriette for sharing their thoughts, opinions, and perspective on addictions, their personal stories and experiences, and helping to bring awareness to addiction and substance abuse. Well, that's everything for today. Thanks again for joining us on the St. Saviour's Virtual Youth Group. My name is Tyler, and I hope we see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notifications every time we post a new video, and head to all of our platforms right now to check out all of our previous videos. See you next time.